Greetings to you, Crocodile Army. I hope you're having a great year so far. Ukrainians are not having a particularly great year so far, unfortunately. In the past month, Russia has amassed over 150,000 troops on three sides of Ukraine. They just invaded Ukraine 8 years ago, adding it to the country of Georgia and their internal region of Chechnya as places where they've intervened militarily in the past decade or two. In 2014, they took Crimea and supported a separatist movement in the eastern Ukrainian area called the Donbass. The separatists had essentially been routed by the Ukrainian military when the Russian military rolled across the border to prop them up and take territory for them, and those lines are the same to this day. Over 7% of Ukraine has been controlled by Russia or Russian separatists ever since. American conservatives used to be the type who were very much fans of Cold War-style politics, and would always be very skeptical of anything Russia said or did, especially in the Soviet era. This was not always the most principled type of opposition, and there was plenty of hypocrisy about who they thought was allowed to do what, but at least they could be counted on to oppose aggression by Russia. In today's Republican Party, many of them see Vladimir Putin as a fellow conservative, which he is. He's an authoritarian who actively cracks down on LGBT rights, has his political opponents and journalists killed, and bullies his neighbors. But he was friends with Trump, and that's more important for many of them. Marjorie Taylor Greene, one of the resident QAnoners in Congress, claims that we shouldn't care because Ukraine was the biggest donor to Hillary Clinton, which is both false and ridiculous. J.D. Vance, author of Hillbilly Elegy and now Ohio Republican Senate candidate, says that we need to pay more attention to events like the trucker convoy and immigration issues rather than Ukraine. Advocating for no help for Ukraine is basically just choosing to give Russia what it wants. A particular section of the left wing of politics has also weighed in with takes just as bad or worse. There's a segment of lefties who don't even want to help Ukraine defend themselves. Some of these people are the types generally referred to as tankies. They usually consider themselves communists, but seem to have no idea that Russia and China are not actually communist, and are probably even less socialist than the US. But they support them anyway because of the basic belief that the Western world is bad, and other countries can do as bad or worse things as long as they think they're communist or against the West. This certainly makes the world very simple to analyze, but also seems to rob them of any self-awareness. These are the types of people who talk non-stop about how many bad things the West has done, which I often agree with, by the way, and then accuse people who highlight Russia's or China's human rights abuses as repeating American government propaganda. And then they'll repeat every Kremlin talking point from Russian state-sponsored media. Hasan is one of the most popular left-wing streamers of all time, and I sometimes like his content, but as with a lot of foreign policy matters, he tends to be very simplistic on his Ukraine coverage. He was crowing last week about how since we were concerned that Russia was going to invade, and that they hadn't yet, that everyone was stupid for thinking they might, despite them having done that just 8 years ago. He said that Russia would be stupid to invade because it would cost a lot to take and hold the country, which is true, but shows that he doesn't understand that holding the whole country forever would likely not be the point. Russia may want a land bridge to Crimea, or just break off more separatist territory in the east, or any number of other unknown strategic goals. Kyle Kulinski, another left-wing commentator, says that we should simply give in to Russia's demands in order to avoid nuclear war, which I also find ridiculous on two levels. First, we're negotiating about Ukraine as if they aren't even in the conversation. We also don't have troops in Ukraine, and nobody is launching nukes over Ukraine because of this. Capitulating to authoritarian regimes rarely ends well. One argument Russian apologists will often use is that this whole thing is our fault in the first place because we helped overthrow Viktor Yanukovych in 2014. Now, we've done a lot of regime change in the world, and that makes this argument understandably easy to buy that we were the ones who caused this. It also paints a picture of a leader in Yanukovych who is generally liked and respected. Both of these things are false. He was very narrowly elected to begin with, and was already a kleptocrat with little regard to human rights, including passing anti-protest laws and approving an order to open fire on protesters. By the time he fled the country to Moscow, he was already widely reviled. Then, protesters stormed his abandoned mansion and found a zoo, 35 cars, and numerous other extravagances that enraged the populace, where about a third of the country's people live under the poverty line. It's no secret that our government didn't much like Yanukovych, but we were not the cause of his ouster. When Russia invaded Ukraine soon after that, unsurprisingly, the areas taken over were the ones where support for Yanukovych was strongest. Someone like Yanukovych couldn't be elected now, so Russia's trying to find another way. Something else you'll hear from Russia apologists is that Ukraine is being run by fascists. Now, every Eastern European country has a number of neo-Nazis that is unhealthy, which is to say that that number is more than zero. But all of them have them, including Russia. They do not have a place in Ukraine's government, however, and none of the 9 parties currently with a voting bloc in parliament are neo-Nazis. Right-wing militias made news in the 2014 invasion because at the time the Ukrainian military was extremely weak, and these militias did a fair amount of fighting. The Ukrainian military is now much larger, better trained, and better equipped, as a professional military should be. This is also another reason for Russia to come up with a pretext for war now. The Ukrainian military has been steadily getting bigger to defend themselves as they recognize the existential threat that Russia poses. Yet it's always mighty Russia who's pretending to be really scared. Russia, the country with thousands of nuclear weapons, and who has one of the largest militaries in the world, says that they're scared of NATO. Despite nothing significant changing since 2014 in terms of their geopolitical position relative to NATO, they now suddenly claim that they're under threat, and are demanding security concessions. They're upset that some former Soviet republics are in NATO, but they have been for many years, so again, why is this suddenly an issue now? Those republics want to join NATO in order to not end up like Ukraine or Georgia. If anyone trusted Russia, it wouldn't be necessary to join. There aren't any nukes in these countries, and the number of standing NATO military forces in those countries are laughably small compared to what Russia could bring to bear. Russia is simply upset that they lose the leverage that threatening a neighbor with military force could do for them. They point to some vague promise for NATO to not expand eastward after the fall of the Soviet Union, which was never in any treaty, as being broken. Note that the agreement with Ukraine in respect to their sovereignty after they gave up their nukes was actually on paper. It was the main point of the Budapest Memorandum, and Russia has utterly ignored it. It should go without saying that my issue is not with the Russian people. Without any independent press to tell them any differently, it's hard to know what they will think if thousands of body bags come back from Ukraine again. I don't pretend to know whether Russia will invade or not, but I really hope that they don't. The separatists are amping up their shelling in the east and making a huge commotion in what was a very static situation for years until now. The Olympics just ended, and they did it right after the Olympics in 2014 too. Even if they don't invade, they've already gone far beyond what is acceptable behavior. It's very strange to lose the element of surprise like this, and the Ukrainian military they face is much better prepared than they were 8 years ago. But they know that ultimately they won't be able to hold up against Russia. The best we can do is supply them weapons to defend themselves and hope that the threat of a high-cost war and sanctions can keep Russia at bay, which we are already doing. I don't want any loss of life, but if Russia invades, and I say this with a hat tip to General Sherman, I hope Ukraine makes Russia howl and sends them back across the border.